Ms. Stuart lay in her bathtub, reflecting on grammar and snoring occasionally. Her nose was above the water, of course, as were her well-rounded knees. Her eyes were closed. The world outside, sensed but not seen through a glazed window behind the tub, was silent. She felt as if she were entirely alone in the world. The 3 stories of her very old house yawned beneath her sleepily. Or really, it wasn't so much an old house as it was a run-down house. 100 and some odd years before, it had been proudly raised, and for a good long stretch thereafter, the house had indeed been proud. But now it sagged, and sometimes it sighed as it seemed to lean on the very tall elm rising majestically beside it. The house had once belonged to the Bakers, as in the Bakers of Baker Street, and given its location atop the steepest street in the old village, almost centrally located between Greenwood Hill and Blackwood Hill, the house could still appear imposing. Ms. Stuart had bought the house for a song a dozen or so years after the last baker had gasped her last while reclining in this very same clawfoot tub, although Ms. Stuart did not know this. Ms. Stuart had thought the house a steal. She had planned to fix it up. She'd leave teaching eventually, and she'd run a bed and breakfast in her mansion, the Baker House, and yes, she'd bake, and would become known for her baking. Tra-la-la. But her days had gotten long. She was actually a good teacher, and the years had passed. Now the house seemed to her, sometimes, an overtaxed monstrosity, impossible to keep or heat, although she loved it dearly. Reflectively, she sniffed the air. She could feel exactly how cold the house was and how dry the air by sniffing. She maintained the thermostat at 58 degrees throughout the fall, winter, and spring. In the summer, of course, it didn't matter, as the house would swell up with humid heat, and the upper floors, windows always shut, would become unbearable to occupy. On her teacher's salary, she could not afford warmth, but this fall had been mild. The days had only recently begun to retain the night's freeze. She kept the windows sealed for practical reasons. She wanted no accidental pets, no uninvited guests, like birds or bats or any round-bellied mammals adept at climbing. She especially wanted no insects, no moths at all, and in any case, she didn't have the time or the inclination to reseal the windows each year, to abolish the draft. As if on cue, an awkward, whirling, detested dot spiraled into the air toward the ceiling light fixture. This dot had come seemingly from nowhere, as these dots always did. It was, in fact, a beetle, an Asian beetle, like a ladybug, but not nearly so nice. These beetles had become a recurring problem each fall, as they attempted to find homes for the winter, but once they got into the house, they would most often die and dry up. Unlike ladybugs, these beetles were known to bite, and they also left stains, especially on white curtains as they crawled around. Asian beetles had first been imported to this continent for agriculture more than a century before, but now they were everywhere. Ms. Stuart had been able to seal out the moths and other little crawlies, but these beetles, seemingly so awkward in flight and on foot, could somehow find a way into her house. This one bumped itself along the ceiling before landing upside down on the light fixture, or, in fact, at the very center of the hemisphere of light, like the impossibly focused pupil of a malign eye. Ms. Stuart pretended to ignore it, but could not help suddenly thinking of pupils, her students, that is, and who needed what, or help with this, or sturdy restraint from that, and so on. It was no use. Her bath ended with loud splashings. She would dress quickly, descend 2 flights of stairs, cross to the pantry where she kept the vacuum cleaner, then return. Hose in hand, she'd remove the offending beetle from her sanctum, at which point she'd carry the vacuum cleaner back to its place in the pantry, where she'd find a snack to go with some tea. She remembered the butter biscuits from the night before. Yes, biscuits would be nice. 2, or maybe 3. Late that night, but still hours before dawn, there began a long, low, steady rumble of uncertain origin. There were not so many people awake at that time, and most of these were sealed in their cars, on their way home from a shift at the hospital or going there. The noise came up so low and slow that most people would have missed it anyway, at least until it became unmistakable. Cook at Fisher's heard it. He was out back taking a smoke break, but not smoking because he had quit, although he still liked going outside for his break. no matter how cold it was, and he liked looking up at the stars. He wondered what the sound could be. He even looked at his watch, so we might say it started at about 2:20 a.m., not that it matters. A couple of hours later, but still before dawn, the rumble had risen in volume, though not in pitch. Loud now, it was like the sound of a waterfall, loud, but not ear-breaking, and steady. It was noticeable now, too, but the volume had risen so slowly and steadily that most people went on sleeping through it. Cook, still at Fisher's, but about to go off his shift, tried to record the sound on his phone. He thought he could sample it for a song. It would have been hard to say where the sound was coming from. It was so low it sounded like it was coming from underground. It sounded like it could be the start of something terrible, like something was about to erupt out of the bowels of the earth. But nothing like that happened, or at least not to anyone's immediate knowledge. And actually, the sound just stopped. A discerning listener might have heard something like static at the end of a long note. Of course, that's when the sound was really noticeable. All across town, people woke up and wondered what they were missing. Ms. Stuart woke up too. It was an hour before dawn and only a few minutes before her alarm would go off, so she got up, never knowing what she had slept through. Nobody even mentioned it to her the next day. All across town there were people who wondered about it, but the few people who did bring it up brought it up to people who had slept through it, so it didn't go anywhere. And Cook doesn't enter this story any further, so we'll have to wait until another day to find out what happened to him and his recording, if anything. At school that day, Ms. Stuart felt tired. She did not know how fitfully she had slept for those several hours before dawn. Her kids were mopey and dopey. When she looked out across the room, she saw slow, blinking, puffy eyes. She almost felt bad about springing a quiz on them, although it was Wednesday and she had told them to expect quizzes on Wednesdays. She waited 2 or 3 minutes after distributing the quiz to begin walking around the room. She knew her kids well enough not to worry about cheating, but she liked to see how they were doing as they were doing it. She was not above offering hints. She viewed quizzes as rehearsals. It was on her second tour of the room, after offering Steve Simpson a quickly whispered consultation, that she noticed something that was really quite disturbing, which she hardly believed she could be seeing correctly. She was walking past Colin Joyner. He was one of Steve's best friends, along with the second Baxter boy. Thankfully not as much a Baxter as the first. Colin's head was bent over his quiz. She paused beside him, thinking to check his work, and there, on the back of his neck, just below the rough fringe of his hair and above the somewhat greasy collar of his flannel shirt, she saw an Asian beetle. Except the beetle was, or it looked like it was, not on his neck, but in his neck, half buried beside one of the bumps of his vertebrae. She stared hard at the red and black polka-dotted shell. She knew she had to be mistaken. The beetle was probably just sitting there, its legs pulled up under the shell, but it looked so much like it was partly buried, like the beetle had burrowed in. The skin was slightly puckered around the shell, but not red at all. "Miss Stuart?" Colin turned his head, and he was looking up at her. She straightened up. She hadn't realized how closely she had bent over him to get a better look. "Colin." She searched for words. "Yeah? Have you finished your quiz?" "Not yet, Miss Stuart. I just started the I want you to go to the nurse's office." The kids around him had started looking up. Colin looked confused. "But I feel fine." "Tell Nurse Crosley to look over your neck and back. Go directly to her office. I'll give you a hall pass." She scribbled her initials hastily on the pink pad she always kept in her belt pack. "But I don't—" "Just do as I say." His hands went to the sides of his neck to check for swelling like a doctor would do. He obviously couldn't feel the beetle on the back of his neck. "Please don't do that. Just ask the nurse, to check, especially the back of your neck." His hands moved toward the back of his neck. "No!" She spoke sharply. His hands withdrew. "There's nothing to worry about. Just please go to the nurse right now." There was something about her voice. The whole class was paying attention now. Colin nodded. When he took the hall pass from her, his eyes met hers briefly. He looked afraid, but not entirely. He also looked dubious. She was already doubting what she had seen. She wanted to call him back to check his neck herself, but she let him go. It was better for Sharon to check. When Colin returned to class 20 minutes later, he went straight to his desk without saying a word. But that was normal behavior. She didn't expect him to say anything, and she didn't try to get anything out of him. She would just have to wait to talk to Sharon at lunch, which is what she did. But Sharon said only that there was a small bleeding spot on Colin's neck, probably from a scab he had picked away. Sharon had sprayed the spot and applied a Band-Aid, and that was it. So Ms. Stuart nodded. She didn't add any further information. She told herself that a scab could look like a red and black beetle's shell, although it still bothered her. If Colin had scratched at the beetle, it would have looked just like he had picked a scab. Over the next few days, Ms. Stuart became more and more convinced that her eyes must have deceived her. She was, after all, a practical woman, in most ways, and except when it came to her house. However, she thought immediately of Colin upon watching her local news on Saturday night. There was a story about a dog. At first, the dog had started running around in circles and barking and whimpering, etc. Then the dog started snapping at people. It bit the dog's owner. Then it ran around the neighborhood biting and howling. It bit 6 people before an officer from animal control was able to subdue it. When it was taken to the veterinarian, they found the dog's head was infested with Asian beetles. They were in its mouth, stuck to the roof of its mouth, and in its ears, around its eyes. Some of the beetles seemed to have burrowed into the skin. The vet they interviewed, a kind-looking, white-haired man, was at a loss to explain what had happened. "I'm no entomologist," he said, "but beetles shouldn't act this way. I didn't even think they had the equipment to dig in like that." Monday morning, Ms. Stuart surprised her class with another quiz. There was shock and dismay all around. The quiz consisted entirely of short essays. These take longer to write. Ms. Stuart wanted plenty of time to walk around to check any and all exposed skin in her classroom. To her relief, she saw nothing to worry her. Colin had a small scab on his neck exactly where she expected to see it, and the scab was very obviously a scab. It certainly could not be mistaken for a beetle. At lunch, Ed Greer of Chemistry and Study Hall sat down 2 chairs away from Ms. Stuart and Sharon, the nurse. But he finished eating, as he always did, very quickly, so he could get back to his classroom, where he would sit leaning back with his eyes closed and his mouth open. After he left the table, as he always did, without so much as a "see you later," Sharon leaned over the table and asked in a suspiciously low voice if Ms. Stuart had heard about the Nunkles. The Nunkles? Out by 16, just past the big Dunkirk sign? Ms. Stuart understood. She nodded. The Nunkles were a family, or more like a clan, out on County Highway 16. There was almost always a nuncle in the school system, but none just now. They lived down a dirt drive just before the turnoff to the old cemetery out that way. She didn't know much about them except what people said, which wasn't much, because the Nunkles kept to themselves. The kids were quiet, kind of stringy and slow, but they stayed out of trouble. The old woman, Emma Nuncle, she was taken to the hospital last night. Miss Stuart nodded. She wasn't sure why she was hearing this. She didn't care much for gossip, and she was frankly surprised her friend was indulging. But she did know Emma Nuncle. She had known her well enough to say hello back when one of the Nunkles was in one of her classes, and back when Emma still came to town. She had been a large woman, and she had sailed around town in a large car from another era. She could be encountered most often while moving slowly down the aisles at Fisher's, leaning across a shopping cart. She usually had 1 or 2 Nuncle kids with her, probably grandkids, whom she'd direct to gather items as she paced steadily forward. "Is a nurse at the hospital, and she told me about it." Miss Stuart had missed some of what Sharon was saying, but she tuned in because her friend's voice had grown increasingly laden. "She said Emma's legs were riddled with, ladybugs, but they were like ticks, the way they were attached to her. Or—" And here Sharon wrinkled her nose, but not theatrically. She was genuinely disgusted. "They were, actually burrowed in really deep." Sharon started to describe the situation in far too much detail. Miss Stuart asked her to stop. She could picture it all too clearly. The old lady's legs, almost translucently white, the speckles of red and black affixed here and there along the old woman's calves, and especially thick on the backs of her thighs, and higher. But no bleeding, and the holes where the beetles had dug in, like Swiss cheese. Miss Stuart did not gag. She was a practical woman, but she held her breath for a moment. And so the whole family is there now, and they found ladybugs on 2 more of them. That boy that was in that accident his last year of high school, he's about 25 now, and the old man. Miss Stuart didn't hear much more. She was thinking about her house. She was planning to stop at the hardware store on the way home. She was going to reseal, double seal, her windows, and she wondered if she should get some kind of spray. The hardware store was busier than Ms. Stuart expected, especially in the areas where she was shopping, but the people there seemed unusually quiet. When they spoke to one another, they leaned in and their voices were hushed. Ms. Stuart suspected immediately that the news of the Nunkles was already spreading around town, but she was wrong, as she learned later. There had been other incidents, less gruesome, yet nonetheless disturbing, mostly around the fringes of town, out past Highside or down near the old Mill Creek neighborhood. People were waking up in the morning, walking into the bathroom, and finding ladybugs attached to their faces or in their armpits and other places. They weren't talking much about it. Nobody in town was prone to say too much about their own business, and they certainly weren't talking loudly yet. But the news, both whispered and garbled, was starting to spread. On Wednesday, 2 mysterious vehicles showed up in town. Miss Stuart saw them before she heard about them. At first, they were parked outside the police station, although one of them moved to the hospital very soon thereafter. They looked like RVs to her, except they were plain white, and they had many antennae and other devices on their roofs. People started referring to them as the mobile units. Ms. Stuart had no idea how this appellation originated. There were at least 2 cars, too. One was dark blue and looked like an unmarked police car. The other was black, people said, but Ms. Stuart hadn't seen it. The appearance of the mobile units changed the conversation around town. Instead of whispering, people started talking out loud about what was happening. Speculation ran rampant. Ms. Stuart listened, but not too closely. She didn't care for hearsay, and she did not feel personally threatened. However, she was vigilant in her class and in her home against any sign of the beetles. Put as briefly as possible, the town seemed to have become infested either with a previously unknown species of insect, either beetle or tick, or the local beetles had somehow mutated. Neither variant of speculation seemed, to Miss Stuart's ears, entirely convincing. Nonetheless, there had now been several reports and well-observed hospital cases in which a kind of tick, looking very much like a beetle, or a beetle acting somewhat like a tick, had been found feeding on animal matter, mostly dogs and humans, but never cats. The ticks did not swell up like wood ticks and gorged on blood. Instead, they just seemed to eat their way into skin, anesthetizing the skin like a tick. The holes didn't bleed either, and they didn't become infected while the ticks were attached. However, the victims did bleed, sometimes surprisingly much, if the holes were deep, when the ticks were removed. There seemed to be some kind of acidic compound in their saliva, which could sting quite badly when exposed to air, which is what drove dogs crazy if they accidentally scratched one or more of the ticks off their eyes or ears. On Thursday, there was a brief official pronouncement warning people to shut up their windows tight and to inspect their bodies thoroughly and often. There was no information whatsoever to explain the emergence of the ticks. Some people said that the local government, news, etc. had been muzzled by the agents in the mobile units. But the mayor insisted, no, this was not true. The mayor's concern was to avoid any unwarranted speculation which might lead to panic. And she wanted to stay out of the way of the medical and scientific authorities who were doing their best to investigate what was happening as quickly as possible. In the meantime, wouldn't it be a good idea to run down to Hank's to buy some bug spray? Hank's was the hardware store in town. They were out, and the big box home store out on Highside was running out. Ms. Stuart could still find some peace and calm each night, no matter what awful things people were saying. The problems people were having seemed to depend mostly on their windows, whether they had proper screens or storms, and whether or not they were closed up tight, and Ms. Stuart was absolutely confident in her own precautions. She could sit quietly in her bath and dream of biscuits and slices of cake, and she suddenly developed a longing for lemon glazes, which can vary enormously depending on their sourness or sweetness. To take her mind off the recent travails, Ms. Stuart had started reading recipes again. It was Thursday night, not late, but very dark outside. As it happened, and despite her precautions, there were at least three. There were several beetles in Ms. Stuart's house. If she had opened her eyes, she might have seen them flying, whirling and swerving in that seemingly awkward way ladybugs fly. These 4 or 5 flew together into the bathroom, swirling in the air like the illustration of an electron. Ms. Stuart did not hear them because these 5 did not bump their way along the ceiling, which is what they usually do, and they all settled quietly together on the wall without so much as a sound. After all, Asian beetles do not buzz like a fly or whine like a mosquito. If they had been observed, one might have thought these beetles were moving deliberately, even stealthily, toward an objective. In fact, we might picture what they saw, although at first it makes no sense because we are seeing through all of their eyes at once. And yes, Asian beetles do have eyes. The beetles are very definitely all looking at Ms. Stuart. She is the fleshy smear in the heat haze of their desire. I'm sorry, but there are no better words than this. It's best to imagine that I'm translating pictures and a kind of chemical feeling, most likely from the antennae, into words. And really, although it won't make sense in this particular story, I can divulge that it isn't even the beetles that are seeing Ms. Stuart. It's something that sees through their eyes and joins all their pictures together. This thing sees only in the present tense, like a jump cut in a movie into the eyes of the monster. And I'm sorry if this seems like a cheesy simile, but I must work with what I find in your imagination. A moment later, the beetles all dropped from the wall together. Catching themselves on the slick membrane wings, they instantly unfolded from under their shells. They whirled directly above Ms. Stuart, now a jumble of pictures almost impossible to join with only human intelligence. However, they did not descend to land either on her chubby knees or the tip of her nose. Instead, they rose toward the top of the window behind the tub. There, unknown to Ms. Stuart, was the tiniest of cracks in the plaster, which led by crooked byways through the wall to the outside world. The beetles crawled through this crack one by one, in a line, as if under command. Friday was a surprisingly warm day. Actually, the temperature had been slowly rising all week. It was the kind of day that should have raised spirits in town, but there was a pall over town, of course, an almost palpable anxiety and some real fear. In Ms. Stuart's class, at least, there was a sense of excitement, the usual excitement of a Friday, and something added, probably because of the sunshine. Nobody in town had noticed yet, but there were no beetles to be seen anywhere. They had vanished. The next day, which was a fine Saturday, such as one might see in an old wholesome movie from the sunniest days of the early 60s, 3 boys went hiking in the woods around the base of Blackwood Hill. Blackwood is notorious in town for several reasons, although it would require a lengthy tangent to fully explain, which won't happen here. The first college in town had been built on Blackwood Hill. In fact, the college had given the hill its name, and not vice versa, as some residents in town supposed. The college closed sometime in the 30s or thereabouts, only to be replaced about a decade later by the Blackwood Institute of Technology, which in turn closed or was shut down in the late 70s. After an even briefer period of private ownership and occupation in the 90s and early aughties, the grounds had been abandoned, fenced up, and had fallen rapidly into disrepair. Only recently, the trustees of Greenwood College, so named for the hill, which had gained its name in a kind of opposition to and misunderstanding of Blackwood, had approved the purchase of the grounds, and renovation had started immediately. The first classes at Blackwood had commenced the prior year. The grounds around the base of the hill were fully wooded, having never been developed. Old no trespassing signs still hung from trees throughout the woods, probably dating from the 90s, but most had fallen down. The black waters of Mill Creek emerged from a marsh at the far side of the base of the hill. The marsh had never been drained because it was fed by numerous springs emerging from under the hill. The nearest neighborhood on the far side was the Mill Creek neighborhood itself, and barely anybody lived there anymore. The nearest neighborhood on the near side of the hill was the old village itself. In any case, our concern here is not for geography or history, but for the 3 boys who went out into the woods that day. As it happened, they were all 3 students of Ms. Stuart: Steve Simpson, Colin Joyner, and Andy Baxter. These 3 boys were quite familiar with these woods. They all lived nearby in the old village, and they had grown up playing in the woods for as long as they could remember, although of course they no longer said they were playing in the woods. Mostly they just hiked and joked. They all 3 carried wrist rockets, which are a kind of slingshot, but they only occasionally used the wrist rockets, and then only to take aim at certain distant trees which had represented orcs and other enemies in the campaigns and quests of their past. Now the wrist rockets were mostly ceremonial, although Colin, a little more imaginative than his friends, still pictured monsters as he took aim, which is probably why his aim was almost always best. The boys were hiking up a steep ravine which was blocked with more detritus than they remembered. There were several fallen trees, and large rocks, some boulder-sized, lay strewn about. They were accustomed to seeing changes in their woods. That was part of the fun of adventuring there, but they had never seen anything like this before. They had started speculating about what could have happened, but their guesses were wild, involving massive lightning strikes and whirlwinds. None of them came close to the correct explanation, which was simply that there had been a large rock fall from further up the hill. As they continued climbing upward, though, they saw that a rock wall they had always called Stony Face had crumbled, and instead of a face there was now a gaping hole, a cave. Truly a marvel to their eyes. The rock fall had occurred quite recently, only about a week or so before, after a night of rumbling from the ground under Blackwood Hill. "I brought a flashlight," Steve answered the question he knew his friends would ask. This wasn't the first cave they had ever found, although it appeared from the outside as though it would be by far the largest. Late on Saturday afternoon, news began to emerge, fragmentary and frantic, about something that had happened up on Old Blackwood Hill, pronounced as if mishap and disaster were natural to the place. 3 boys had been fooling around and went into a cave they had found. They had decided to have a snack there, right inside the mouth. After a couple of minutes, they weren't sure quite how long, they heard a sound they couldn't describe very well. Jumbling, rustling," one of the boys said, but he wasn't making much sense. Before they could move or say a word, a cloud of beetles came up from out of the darkness inside the cave. They all jumped up to run. The cloud descended over one of the boys. It actually swerved towards him as he was running. He fell down. A kid named Andy. The other boys stopped and turned around. There's no way they were going to leave Andy behind. But they couldn't see him. They couldn't reach him. He was inside a giant ball of beetles like 20 feet high. One of the boys, Colin, reached his arm into the ball to find his friend, but he couldn't feel anything except the squirming insects. When he pulled his hand back out, he didn't have any fingers or a thumb. After that, the 2 boys, Colin and Steve, ran screaming into town to try to get help. Later, although it was a strange thing to recall after all that had happened, it emerged that the boys had been eating chocolate chip cookies. The one that was presumably eaten by the beetles, not a trace of him was found, had been pretending to be the Cookie Monster, a character from an old TV show which had crumbled up cookies as it ate them. Andy was covered in cookie crumbs, all over his clothes and face, and even in his hair. The boy Colin said that was why they went after him. It was the cookies. Most people just shook their heads when they heard this part of the story, but when they told it in turn, this was the part they made sure to slow down and say meaningfully, as if somehow it explained everything. Ms. Stuart's distress at the news about her boys, as she suddenly, silently thought of them, was surprising to her and almost unbearable. She felt like she was going to burst, literally as if something in her chest might split in half. She could barely hold herself together on Monday as she stood in front of her class. When she looked at Andy's empty seat, she actually let a noise escape, something between a heave and a groan. The kids were terrified. Of course, Colin and Steve were also absent from class that day, so when the principal hastily organized an assembly to talk about sadness and loss, they were not the subjects of the school's attention. Instead, everyone kept looking at Ms. Stuart herself, where she sat up on the stage behind the principal's podium. Ms. Stuart's face was glossy under the stage lights, streaming with tears. She could not speak when she was called upon to say a few words. She cried so hard she had difficulty breathing, and the nurse interrupted the proceedings to convey Ms. Stuart from the stage. Afterward, several of the faculty and the principal recommended that Ms. Stuart take a day or two off, but she wouldn't have done it if her friend Sharon had not insisted it would be better for the kids. So it was on Tuesday that Ms. Stuart, walking the aisles of Fisher's at midday on a regular weekday, which she could not recollect ever having done before, heard again and again the stories that were being said across town. She heard about how the cave was being investigated, but so far no living beetles had been found. There were enormous quantities of dead beetles carpeting the floor of the cave's main chamber, but not nearly enough to account for an entire cloud. The cave had several passages, some branching and twisting almost like a tree's branches, so that the furthest passages were smallest. Unnatural, a geologist from Greenwood College later pronounced, but by then the town was growing accustomed to such unnaturalities. These passages were narrow and impassable. The appropriate authorities, police and fire departments, sheriff's office, and personnel from the mobile units, were doing everything they could to find living beetles. They even went so far as to push small charges at the ends of long poles into some of the narrowest passages, which were then exploded remotely, but to no effect. Hank in his hardware store said they should have rigged up something with remote control cars or drones and cameras, but frankly there hadn't been time yet to proceed to such lengths. She also heard more than once what people were saying about the boys. She too shook her head when she heard the Cookie Monster story the first time. However, and I'm sorry, but I must interrupt the story here just for a moment to say I personally find this to be the strangest part. As she walked those aisles, maybe barely aware of what she was actually doing, she gathered together certain ingredients: flour, butter, a vial of vanilla extract, brown sugar and white sugar, baking powder, and 3 bags of semi-sweet chocolate chips. She probably already had most of these ingredients at home in abundance, but it was almost as though she were making sure she had the right ingredients to make a very large batch, maybe several large batches of chocolate chip cookies. It was on Wednesday then that this particular story, the one I'm telling now, reached its conclusion, although of course this was really just the beginning. Ms. Stuart was still at home. In fact, at 10 or so in the morning, she was still in her bathrobe. Her eyes were puffy and red. Her nose was red. She had a sore throat. She was slowly stirring a large stainless steel bowl. The oven had been preheated. A baking pan was buttered, sitting on the counter. If anyone had seen her, it would have been obvious she was deeply preoccupied. If someone who knew her had seen her, they would have thought something was profoundly wrong. Ms. Stuart did not ever just stare at the floor. There was never any stray hair crossing in front of her eyes or any slackness in her jaw, which was always set firmly, or even thrust ever so slightly forward. Yes, a little pugnaciously. What was she doing? Stirring. Why? No response. Suddenly, she raised her head and looked up in the air. The town's tornado alarm had sounded. Her eyes snapped into focus. She set down the bowl. She turned to look out the kitchen window. She couldn't see anything. She walked calmly out of the kitchen across her dining room and her parlor to the front door. She opened it purposefully, even a little slowly. From there, she could see wide across the town, from Greenwood Hill all the way over to Blackwood Hill, with her own school near the center of town, a few blocks back from downtown, which was on this side of the highway and the river. At first she saw nothing in particular, but her eyes were drawn to Blackwood Hill. She thought she saw a haze, a smudge of darkness or smoke spreading above the treetops around the base of the hill. She wondered if someone had started a fire. Maybe the fire was a threat to the village? She shook her head. The smoke was darkening, thickening, slowly building up into the air. She watched without moving, almost as if she was paralyzed, but not by fear. The smoke was billowing now, but slowly, and it was taking unusual shapes, like a murmuration of starlings or a cloud of blackbirds over a cornfield in slow motion. The cloud was twisting, turning, and roiling through the air. It was turning toward the village. Ms. Stuart's eyes flitted from the cloud at the base of the hill across half of town to her school. It was as if she knew what was going to happen. She did know. She moved quickly. She left the door open. She returned to the kitchen as fast as she had ever moved, although she wasn't quite running. She grabbed a spatula. She lifted gobs of cookie dough from the bowl and just smeared it onto the baking pan. She wasn't taking the time to form nice cookie balls with her hands. She realized she hadn't yet added the chocolate chips to the dough. She ripped open a bag with her teeth. She poured the entire bag over the pan, then smashed down on the chips and the dough with the palms of her hands. When she put the pan into the oven, she slammed the door, although this did make her wince ever so slightly. She looked around. What could she do now? There was more dough in the bowl. She grabbed 2 more pans, not buttered, and repeated the process. She stood breathing heavily at the oven. She looked closely at the temperature and turned it up 50 more degrees. No, 75. She returned to the front door to see that the cloud of beetles had seemingly rolled down the hill toward town. The direction of the cloud was now unmistakable. She watched for a long minute, estimating. Luckily, there was a slight breeze blowing across town, descending from the hills and flowing out toward the river. That would work in her favor. It seemed to her the cloud would take 25 or maybe 30 minutes to move from where it was to the school. Her house was not far from the school. In the past, she had often walked to school, although she had fallen out of that habit in recent years. She went back inside. She had 3 fans scattered in closets on the first floor for use during the summer. She carried the first one upstairs all the way to the 3rd floor. There she struggled for several precious minutes. No matter how much tape and plastic she pulled away from the window in her sewing room, she could not get the window to budge. And so she made the first truly conscious, truly heartbreaking decision she would have to make. She lifted the wooden chair from beside the sewing table and heaved it through the window. No, the shattered glass did not seem to her like her shattered heart. Ms. Stuart was a practical woman. Once the window was open, she set the fan in the window facing outward, plugged it in, and set it on high. She then returned to the first floor to get another fan. This she placed in the broken window of the guest bedroom. The last she placed in the bathroom window. She barely paused in motion as some of the glass fell inward, landing in her tub. There was no time to feel sorry for herself. Now, breathing hard, she descended to the first floor again, this time passing by way of the pantry through the kitchen to check on her cookies. She smiled. The smell of the cookies was rising in the air. When people tell the story of Ms. Stuart, I often feel they rush too much. I suppose it's a matter of taste, but I think it's important to realize both how slowly those last minutes unfolded and how quickly, how very precisely Ms. Stuart needed to execute the last few steps. She stood at the front door again, and now she was certain she had failed. The cloud of beetles was close, too close to the school. The kids were still inside, sheltering. That darn principal had waited too long, although maybe he couldn't have known what was coming. Maybe nobody could have known, except Ms. Stuart, from where she stood at her front door. If he let them out now, the cloud would have fallen on them. The cloud itself was thick, black, and churning, like smoke from a chemical fire. It stretched halfway from the school back toward Blackwood Hill. It was gathering in mass as it rolled toward the school. Ms. Stuart stood breathless. She could not do anything now but wait, and she was certain she had failed. But she hadn't. She sensed the turn even before her eyes could confirm it. From about the middle of the mass, not the head hanging right then over the school, A bulge was forming. The cloud was reforming and turning, pulling that head away from the school. The cloud was reshaping itself and rising. It was coming toward her, lifting toward the smell of cookies baking. Ms. Stuart nodded. Her final decision was already made. She walked calmly to the garage. She had time to spare, maybe 5 minutes or more. In fact, she had to be careful not to act too quickly now. Ms. Stuart wanted her actions to be decisive. If her sacrifice was to be as effective as possible, she would need to wait not just for the cloud to mass above the house, but for it to descend to the windows on the 3rd floor. She would have to wait while the mass streamed in through the windows. She'd listen as the jumbling rustling descended her stairs, and then she'd need to move very quickly. She had worried the smell of gasoline might ruin her plans, and it would have. So she waited, and when the cloud had crowded itself into her home, first spreading across the 3rd floor and then the 2nd, when it had almost reached the 1st floor, she sprang into action. She dumped gasoline all around her parlor and her dining room. She moved methodically and very quickly. Her jaw was thrust forward, but her thoughts had turned inward. She was saying goodbye. She saw the horde just as her boys had seen it, although now there were many, many, many more beetles. It was almost on top of her when she struck the match. The authorities have been unequivocal about Ms. Stuart's accomplishment. She saved the town. Certainly, she saved countless lives. She might not have destroyed every last beetle in the air that day, but she did such significant damage to them, or to it, the cloud of beetles, a single monstrous force, that the beetles did not return as a menace. Ms. Stuart herself recovered surprisingly quickly and with good grace. She was a practical woman and certainly not a fool. Before she struck the match, she had positioned herself in front of her open front door. She had time to step outside and close the door. She then ran like hell itself was behind her until she got to the school. She could think of nowhere else to go. She wanted to see her kids. Of course, she lost the house. That's how she came to live at the Stepping Stone apartment complex, which is, in one sense, a play on our town's name, Stone's Way. Eventually, and by steps which I or others will describe elsewhere, but not in this story, this is also how Ms. Stuart came to her exceptional role in our future. Because, of course, the key individuals of our group all eventually assembled here at the Stepping Stone. But Ms. Stuart was the first, and I the second, because I came with her, the last remnant of the last baker of the Baker House. Although I'll need to explain more about myself later.